Mr. Speaker.
Time's up.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to move my motion now, if I may. As I've given notice yesterday, I would like to move that pursuant to Standing Order 1082, this committee meet for an additional 2 days for the purpose of the consideration of Bill C-45, an act respecting cannabis, and to amend the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act, the Criminal Code, and other acts, and that the chair be empowered to coordinate the witnesses to a minimum of 32 witnesses, 8 per stakeholder group, the resources and scheduling necessary to complete this task in accordance with the following guidelines.
Let's excuse the witnesses. They've been here a long time. Then we'll continue on with your issue. Okay? Is that all right with you?
I got all the time in the world.
All right.
Unemployed.
But we invited the witnesses to be here.
You said, Mr. Chair, that I was the last speaker, so whether they're sitting there or not doesn't seem to really matter. But
I just think we should thank the witnesses and for their contribution. They've all made a unique contribution, everyone. We value them all. They're very important testimony today. So on behalf of all the members of the committee, I want to thank you all for your contribution and your information. So with that, go ahead.
I'll just continue reading. I'll continue reading where I was. 1. Witnesses are to represent the following stakeholder groups in 4 2-hour panel blocks per day. 1. Existing Canadian licensed producers and dispensaries. 2. Producers of edible cannabis products and other non-smokable forms of cannabis. 3. Ordinary Canadians who made a written submission to this committee regarding C-45. And 4. Young Canadians, 15 to 24 years old. Number 3, that witnesses for each panel block be allotted as follows: 2 Liberal, 1 Conservative, 1 NDP. 4, that witnesses be directed to prepare oral remarks for 10 minutes in length, and that the witnesses be invited to submit written statements prior to appearing. And 5, that the meetings be held prior to September 30, 2017. Mr. Speaker, I'm going to speak to my motion and give the rationale behind it. C-45 is groundbreaking legislation in many respects. It changes a century of legal, social, economic, and cultural policy in this country. It's 131 pages long. It's 226 sections plus schedules. It deals with a number of complex issues about cannabis decriminalization. It involves cultivation, possession, age of access, health impacts, enforcement, production, packaging, labeling, international implications, edibles and concentrates, education, research, and other issues. Now, the Liberals proposed in June 5 days of hearing only to be conducted the week before Parliament resumed. They solicited the opinion of Canadians over the summer, when Canadians are probably least engaged in public policy. They have scheduled these hearings before Canadians could even be really fully engaged. In many respects, the hearings are over before most Canadians are really engaged in the hearings at present. By scheduling the entire week of hearing before the House of Commons, it avoids scrutiny in the House of Commons and restricts the ability of MPs to raise evidence that we hear in the House of Commons to question the ministers and government, as responsible government should allow us to do. It restricts the committee's ability to properly follow up on issues that arise from the testimony. And we've heard a lot of testimony this week that raises many issues that I think MPs on all sides of the table would like to be able to follow up on. Now, at that time in June, both the New Democrats and Conservative opposition objected to those 5 days. We said we need more days. And I want to pause to emphasize that this committee is the only phase of the legislative process where Parliament hears from the public, from stakeholders, from experts. It's the only opportunity for public input. And I believe that it's very important to hear those views as we do our job to study this bill. Now, at that time in June, when the opposition objected to the limitation of 5 days of hearing, the Liberals agreed. And they said that they were open to holding more hearing days if needed. Now, today, after 5 days of hearing, it's obvious that there are glaring holes in this bill and that there are many issues that have been raised and most importantly, that there has been an absence of critical voices. We have not yet heard a word from young people. We haven't had one witness aged 15 to 24. Yet, Mr. Speaker, we have heard from all sorts of people about how important it is that we get this cannabis legislation right for young Canadians, the health impacts on developing brains, how important it is that we talk to young people in a manner that they will accept and understand, how we're to be protecting the health of young Canadians, and yet we don't bother to listen to a single one to tell this committee about their access and how they feel about this issue. We haven't heard a word from ordinary Canadians, and there were many ordinary Canadians who wrote this committee with submissions and requested to appear. We didn't schedule one of them. Third, we haven't heard from any licensed producers themselves, the very people who have been growing legally cannabis in this country for the last 10 years. And fourth, we've heard a lot of evidence, and I think some exaggeration and maybe even some mythology about the impacts of edibles, but we haven't heard from a single edible and concentrate manufacturer or industry. Now, quite honestly, I think that these are glaring errors. Yet, for some reason, I believe that the Liberals do not want to hear from a single one of these groups. Now, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, the New Democrats support legalization. We broadly support this bill. Frankly, we believe that this bill can be brought into force by next July, and we're willing to work with the government to do so. We want to work with the government to fix the holes that are in this bill that we've already identified: the absence of edibles and concentrates, the fact that there's a lack of a national e-commerce platform, the fact that this legislation does not deal with pardons, the fact that we have border issues and international considerations. There's all sorts of aspects to this bill that I think require further scrutiny. The fact that it still criminalizes many Canadians, including maintaining a maximum penalty of up to 14 years in prison for Canadians. So it is not the New Democrats' intention to be deleterious or to delay in any way the government's stated objective of hitting July 1. That's why in the context of my motion in the text, I said that we could hold those 2 days by September 30th. We know that the ministers are scheduled to appear next week on Tuesday, and we know at that process we're going to need at least after that we're going to need at least a week or two to prepare the many amendments before we start the clause-by-clause examination of this bill, where we're going to go through the entire bill line by line and discuss and debate and move amendments. We are into October no matter what. So I think it's eminently reasonable to say, let's schedule 2 more days of hearing to hear from those groups that are so important to hear from prior to September 30th, so that we can make sure that we have the broadest, most comprehensive evidence and information that we can get before this committee, and still allow the government to meet its stated objective. Now, I'm going to conclude by saying it's my understanding that the Liberals are going to vote against this motion. They're going to have to tell Canadians, explain to them why the voice of youth are not important to inform this bill, why the voice of ordinary Canadians are not important. And I want to stop and say on that this bill isn't for producers, it's not for dispensary owners, it's not for edible manufacturers. This bill is for the millions of Canadians who voted last election for the promise of legalization of cannabis. And to proceed with this bill without hearing from them is unacceptable. You know, the government side may argue, well, they heard from the task force. That was to inform the process. What I want to hear from are those people about this legislation. I think that they have a right, now that legislation has been drafted and tabled before Parliament, they have a right to now offer their comment on the actual proposals that have been before us, particularly when the government has ignored several recommendations of the task force in this legislation. So I really hope that the Liberal government will see fit to include these important voices. And if not, I hope they have a good explanation as to why these important voices are not important to be heard at this committee. Where, I will conclude here, the difference is this. it's not enough to say that people can contact MPs on their own, or we can hold town halls, which many of us have done or are doing. To testify at this committee is to testify in front of the entire health committee, in public, recorded, televised, and in both languages. And that provides a unique opportunity to hear that voice that is not fully accommodated in any other fashion. So for all those reasons, Mr. Chair, I would urge my colleagues to support this very reasonable motion so that we can bring Canadians the best, safest, healthiest cannabis legislation that we can possibly craft as Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Ms. Sidhu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I'll be speaking against this motion. And I want to remind this committee, my colleague, Mr. Davies, voted in favor of this motion when we set up the 5 days uninterrupted study. We are doing this. Our government ran campaign on this issue in 2015. 2016, Cannabis Task Force worked for 6 months, consulted over 30,000 Canadians, and traveled across the country and to the other jurisdiction. Committee heard over 100 witnesses this week, including over 40 hours of testimony from government, law enforcement, medical community, researchers, scientists. Committee also received 100 written submissions. All three parties worked over this summer to build their witnesses list in preparation for this study. In addition, provinces and territories are doing their consultation. And I just want to thank you, Chair. Thank you all the colleagues. I think it's an important piece of legislation. We should move forward.
Okay. Dr. Carey.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank Don for bringing this forward. I think well said, Don. Thank you for that. And he reiterated that in June we did vote against this. The Liberals wanted to kind of pigeonhole us into 5 different days with different topics, and we did want to hear from different groups, and Don has brought forward the names of some of those groups. At the end of the day, I think Canadians expect us to be looking at after the health and safety of Canadians. That's what this committee is all about. And if you listen repeatedly to the Liberal talking points, it's consistently they want to keep this out of the hands of kids, and they want to keep the proceeds away from organized crime. Throughout these witnesses we've heard, even from Liberal members, it's obvious that there are huge gaps in this bill. And if we don't get it right, we've heard it over and over again, this could actually make things worse for everybody in Canada. So I know we're going to hear the government come up and they're going to say, well, we've heard so many witnesses, the number of witnesses and that, and they're going to compare it to other studies they did. Well, I'm not interested in that. These other studies, sometimes they were shut down as well. We were promised that the Liberals were open to more witnesses, and what this has done for me is really given me a perspective on how complicated this issue is, how different levels of government, they need to get the boots on the ground. They got to get these all prepared. And I think, as my Liberal colleagues have noticed, there are huge gaps in this bill. And I think we need a little bit more, let's say, perspective and make sure we get it right. That's the least we can do for Canadians. So, Don, we'll be supporting your motion.
I do.
Thank you, Chair.
I just want to speak also in support of the motion. I was very disappointed this morning that when I suggested adding more meetings for more witnesses, that the Liberals shut that down. They keep saying they're not rushing, but it looks like they're rushing. And we haven't heard from Uruguay. It's the only country in the world other than us that's ever legalized marijuana. We should at least hear what they have to say. There are a number of other things that have come out through the testimony that have pointed out gaps that we would need to close, the border issue, the international treaty issue, a number of different things that are not addressed, the revenue sharing, things that we would need to hear more testimony on. And so thank you, Don, for bringing that forward, and I will be supporting.
Mr. Davies.
Just briefly, in response to Ms. Sidhu's comments, again, the original motion by the Liberals was to have 5 days of hearing only, and after deliberation, this committee changed that motion to say that there would be an initial 5 days of testimony plus the possibility of additional days if necessary, and the Liberals agreed to that. Now, after 5 days of hearing, Liberals are saying, no, there's no more possibility of further days of hearing. So if anything, it's the Liberals who are backtracking on the commitment made in June. And second, I'd like to say that, again, hearing from Canadians on the task force is not the same as hearing Canadians comment on the drafted legislation, particularly when the legislation deviates from the task force recommendations. And my one example is edibles. The task force said, for various reasons, after listening to 30,000 Canadians, studying the experience for the jurisdictions, they came to the considered and evidence-based position that this government should legalize edibles, and that's what Canadians told them, and then the government tables legislation that ignores that. I want to hear what Canadians have to say about that. And finally, again, I'll just say this, that, I don't need 50 and 60-year-olds telling me how to talk to a 16 and 17, 18-year-old. I want to hear from the 16, 17, and 18-year-old what they think about cannabis. And I think to shut out that voice and not hear risks us doing a great disservice to all of the stated concerns that people have stated about the health of young Canadians. I'll just stop there, and I'm happy to proceed to a vote if
All right.
my colleagues want that.
Seeing no more speakers, we'll call for a vote. All in favor of this?
I'd like a recorded vote, please.
I have a point of order, too.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, that here in Health Committee, we have certain members that are part of this committee, and I think it was tabled in the House, and I think officially Mr. Kang is still a member of this committee, and I'm not sure if the Liberal government can substitute another Liberal member. I know Mr. McKinnon's here, and I appreciate his input, very good input into the committee, but technically speaking, if the government party can actually substitute a member in for an independent, and then if that member actually has the right to vote. I was wondering if you could let us know the rules on that.
My ruling is that he can be substituted, and Mr. McKinnon is legitimate as a voting member of the committee. Mr. Davies.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair. I just want to make sure that I'm requesting a recorded vote, please, on my motion.
Okay, we go to a vote.
Monsieur Ayoub? Oui, sur la motion de Monsieur Davies. Dr. Ailson?
No.
Mr. McKinnon?
No.
Mr. Oliver?
No.
Ms. Sidhu? Dr. Carey? Ms. Gladue?
Yes.
Mr. Davies?
You betcha.
Nays contre 5, yes pour 3.
Motion defeated. So that's the end of meeting 68. Thanks very much, everybody.